I guess to their point, they would say, well, work is something that we're forced to do. We don't want to do it. I mean, I almost think about it from a Marxian perspective, right? That the purpose of work is just to get a certain amount of output, and then we should be able to do the rest of the things that we want to do. It's really a side effect of the labor theory of value that goes into everything. And so we as workers, we should get 100% of it. The corporations, the employers, they're the ones that are taking all this away from us. And I wonder what your viewpoint is on some of those folks who are misguided in those ways. Welcome again to another episode in the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have on a guest who's been on before, a little over a year ago. We had a great conversation then, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today about full-time work and the meaning of life, his new book. It's a great book that you've got to go and check out. I'll put it in the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com. But it's none other than David Bahnsen. David, welcome back to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks so much for having me again. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure of mine, David. You're doing so much great work with your podcast and everything else, with Capital Record and then Capital Dividend. I mean, I'm eating it up all the time. So keep up the good work that you're doing along with the book. For the audience, let me just do a quick overview of your bio, and then we'll get right into it. So David Bahnsen is the founding managing partner and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a national private wealth management firm with offices in Texas, and across the country. He is the author of several best-selling books, which I'm hopeful that this one will be. It's been a great book as well. We've got a lot to talk about, so I kind of want to leave it there and jump right into it, David. I usually start with what motivates you to do what you do, and you've kind of told me and the audience already about what that is. But I wonder if anything's changed in the last year of what's motivating you to do what you do every day.
Well, nothing has changed on the motivation. I mean, the way in which it gets executed, some of the particular strategy and execution that I bring to my business endeavors is always changing, always growing and adapting as needed. But my motivation has always been to work to the glory of God, to work to build His kingdom. And I believe when it comes to the realm of finance, that I am seeking to use the market economy to allow for a return on investment that it can only happen if somebody is facilitating the production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity. And that the capital return is used to meet the needs of the investors. The capital that they put in is used to meet the needs of producers, and the products, goods, and services made by the producers is used to meet the needs of consumers. I think you get a virtuous cycle out of financial markets, and I've devoted my life to that process. The thing that's just a little unique is instead of only devoting myself to that actual process and the implementation of it in the realm of wealth management, I've decided to devote a part of my life to defending it and speaking about it as well. And that's where the books and the podcast and the writing come from. I've become convinced, Vance, and you probably are, deal with this as well. I think we both believe in markets. But I don't believe markets are a great self-promoter, a line I stole from Don Boudreaux at George Mason. I think that markets need vigorous defense, and that's what I want to do.
Yeah, well, you're doing a great job of it, so keep it going. And I always liked how you talk about a virtuous and free society. Oftentimes, and David, I'm more of a libertarian and classical liberal in that sense. And so I think about it from more of the free society part, but I'm also a Christian. And faith is a big part of my life and something that I want to talk to you about today with your book, which really touched me a lot with the way that you were able to put the biblical principles to work. Because we often forget about that. The virtuous part is just as important as the free society, right?
Yes, and the only thing I would say is, and I doubt there's much daylight between our respective views on this. I've followed your work, and I'm reasonably familiar with where you're coming from too. I don't identify as a libertarian, but I certainly identify as a classical liberal. But to me, it's not merely that I think the virtue and the freedom are important, but they're important in an integrated way. I think the lack of one assures the loss of the other. And so for someone to treat virtue and freedom like an asset allocation, and say, I want 25% here, 75 there, I don't believe it works that way. I think that virtue is needed as a bedrock to liberty, and liberty is needed as a bedrock to virtue.
Yep. Well put. So let's just jump right into it. You know, you're going around, you're giving these speeches about your new book, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And I wonder, what's your elevator pitch? What's the main points that you like to get across? And then we can kind of dig in deeper into some of those.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been in a lot of different elevators since the book came out, because if I'm talking to a particularly evangelical audience, there's a kind of focus I have. If I'm talking to a more politically conservative audience that may or may not be faith-based, there's a little bit different of something I'm going for. And if I'm in a more hostile environment, or one that I can't take for granted as either faith-oriented or even politically center-right, there's a different message, just sort of culturally speaking, as to what I view about the importance and dignity of work. So I think we find ourselves in an interesting moment where there's a lot of mistakes that are either being made or about to be made. All of them some version of a inadequate view of work. And the elevator pitch of the book is, I'm advocating for not merely a high view of work, but one that is rooted to an existential argument, an ontological argument. What I mean by that is the being of humanity, the very essence of the human person, is that they were made by God to be a worker. And that productive aspect that has largely driven my belief system about economics since I was a very, very young guy, I think it's more or less at the root. There's a lot of overlap on the Venn diagram between the classical school, the Austrian school, and the supply side school. One of the overlaps is in the primacy of production, of driving supply of goods and services in terms of promoting economic growth and prosperity. Fundamentally, this is all presupposing human beings working, exercising their capacity for creativity, for innovation, and for productivity. I believe that we do that because we are made by God to do it. So a low view of work is not merely bad economics, but I think it is bad human psychology.
Yeah. Man, it's a lot to think about there, because I think you're right, of course. Are there certain scriptures, and not to put you on the spot to state scriptures, but are there certain ones that drive you to that point? I think it's well put.
If I
Don't
can't,
get me wrong.
If being asked that puts me on the spot that I should not have written this book, I use primarily the book of Genesis, and there's a lot from there, but I have to start at creation. And the reason why, for those that are a little bit familiar with sort of Christian theology, is there are people who believe that, God made the world, and then there was this thing called sin that entered the world, and then now we have work because of sin. It's a curse that we have to deal with, and it's a very flawed view. I believe that right at the outset, God made us to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, to subdue it, rule over it. So Genesis 1:26 through 28 is the sort of starting mandate for work. And it is well before sin entered the world. But even apart from that, I believe that God made mankind with an elevated dignity. I do not believe that armadillos or rabbits or trees or lakes share the dignity or the image-bearing likeness of God that mankind does. So what does that mean? What does it mean that we are made in the image of God? I think it doesn't mean we're all knowing or all powerful as He is. I think it means that we're workers. And that's how He defined it, right in the very initial creational norm passage of Genesis 1. He goes on in Genesis 2:15, again, still before sin, to say that He wanted mankind to rule over the garden, to work and care for the garden. And there's two Hebrew words used there, avodah and shamar. And avodah is the same word, Hebrew word used in 6 days shalt thou work and do all thy labor. And it literally is translated in Hebrew at times as work, as worship, and as serve. I think there's this incredible spiritual message around the importance of work as what we are doing to, in fact, serve God. Shamar meant to care for. It's the same word used as shepherd caring for their flock. It's at times used to describe God caring for us, his people, in the book of Psalms. We were to care for the earth that way. And you notice, Vance, when you look into Genesis 5, 6, 7, some of the later chapters, there were cities built.
Yeah.
There was civilization. Where was this coming from? Where did mankind get the idea to invent the wheel? How did it learn how to start a fire? These things were not created. Mankind created them from the raw materials of God's creation.
Yeah.
This process has been playing out for however many number of years, and it eventually resulted in an iPhone. It resulted in digital technology allowing us to record right now. It not just all the digital impressive elements of a digital technology, digital age, but really from brick and mortar to the arts and music to all elements of human life, technology, manufacturing, finance. These are all different spheres and categories in which mankind is to work.
Yeah.
And I find it a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I do too. And I think something else that I enjoyed about your book was about, what you called created purpose, where that is the created purpose, right? Is for us to work and to be able to glorify God and serve God in that way through our work and through what we're doing here on earth, right?
Exactly right. And I think that the lack of that created purpose ends up creating a lot of loneliness, sometimes depression. This is where I meant to a sort of modern secular psychology crowd. I believe that they would diagnose work as a source of our problems. Too much stress, too much anxiety. Bernie Sanders saying we need a 32-hour work week. Yeah. This sort of obsession with some for more yoga classes at 4 p.m. and greater amenities and cushions around our life. And I'm not being an old curmudgeon here, but I think that there is a sense in which the further we get away from created purpose, the more unhappy people will be. And the more we migrate to created purpose, the more happy they will. So to have properly ordered lives, which is the goal in human flourishing, I think it requires a much better understanding of work than we seem to have today.
Yeah, great point there. And I think with all that background, that gives us a good foundation of the importance of work and how it's created by God for us to serve him, to do all these things, but also to benefit from that work over time. I mean, the fruits of our labor and things of that nature allow for us. If you think about the Robinson Crusoe, I remember teaching economics, I'd always talk about the one person Robinson Crusoe, where he's going out and getting a spear. Instead of having to fish with his hands, he's able to use a spear. Instead of just laying down on the ground, he's able to build a shelter. These are things that help improve our lives to then serve God in a more flourishing way than we otherwise would. And I think, to your point, we are missing a lot of that today. I know that you took a lot of time in the book to talk about what happened during the pandemic and the influence that has had on the psyche, I think, of work, of the policy implications from the expansion of government from work. But I thought, I'd ask you to talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I think that one of the issues that has bothered me for some time on the right is a critique of the welfare state that I fully agree with, a critique of transfer payments that I fully agree with, a critique of different social programs, what have you, where the conclusion that some of these things are bad, I would fully agree with. Yet I don't believe that enough on the right are making a full argument as to why. Yeah. Oftentimes they revert to an unaffordability argument, which I would think by now is not convincing anyone. People are more than willing to spend money whether we have it or not. But also beyond that, the reason I oppose government subsidy of people not working is not merely because of what it does to the P&L of the Treasury Department, which of course is the taxpayers. It's because it removes people from created purpose. Now, it has the combined effect insidiously of being unaffordable, of being unsustainable, of being counterproductive. That we have spent more money on poverty than the poverty problem itself represented, and we haven't solved poverty. So there's all sorts of pragmatic arguments that are either Hayekian or that Thomas Sowell has talked about, all of which I fully agree with completely. Yeah. But yet, even beyond that, I believe that, like if Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos all got together and wrote a check saying we will fund the welfare program, we'll give DC the money, and then you can go distribute it so that during the COVID moment, we'll pay people not to work, and we'll detach work requirements from welfare, which was one of the great contributions of the Clinton-Gingrich bill signed back in the mid-90s. Yep. Even if it was fully paid for, I think it is taking people out of something they were created for. Yeah. I'm not referring, obviously, to those dire situations of physical disability, of needs-based related issues. We can work on the margins, and in fact, we do. We have a very charitable society for those types of situations. But the rule being of Keynesian humanism, that there is a certain class of people that are made to produce and a certain class of people that are not. And I don't believe it. I think it's elitist and snobbish. And I think God made all of us with the capacity to work.
Yeah, yeah. Well put, David. And I always like where you're coming from. And whenever we were talking or on your podcast, what you do a great job of is digging down to the assumptions, the foundations for which we should be evaluating certain policies, life itself in many ways. And I think that sets you apart, David, from a lot of other folks that are out there. Because oftentimes I see them jumping to conclusions without having the strong foundation of where they need to be. And I don't, what preceded that for you? How did you get in this state of mind of looking at those foundations and assumptions?
Well, the book is dedicated to my late father, and that's the answer. Is I was very blessed to be raised by Dr. David Bahnsen, and so on one hand, it's very tragic that he died in his 40s. I was only 20, and so I had to part from my dad, who was my best friend and my mentor, at a very young age. But the blessing I had was I was raised to consider first principles. And that notion of first things being a foundation on which I then go on to try to understand the natural sciences or economics or politics. Whatever the field or discipline is, I seek to do so from a foundation. And that was my father's area of specialty, was epistemology, the theory of knowledge, how we can know things. He had a PhD in philosophy at USC, and so he was a real worldview-oriented guy, and I didn't follow in his footsteps as an academic or a theologian or philosopher, but I very much have attempted to root my views on economics to first things. And one of you had me on after my No Free Lunch book, 250 Economic Truths, came out, and that's really kind of a discovery that I'm still going through now, which is my just daily being shocked at how many people have a good instinct for free markets but never rooted it to first principles. And they seem to be highly susceptible to abandoning first principles when there are various exogenous shocks to the system. The seminal moment of my life was the global financial crisis. And out of the GFC, I remain utterly stunned how many people could not maintain some belief system in a market economy. And I think that was really the moment that attracted Bernie Sanders and AOC to young people. And in a lot of ways, I blame the free market movement for it because it was not properly tethered to a foundation that was strong enough. The efficiency argument for markets, I think, is inadequate. I believe markets are efficient. I believe that they are superior to the outcomes of collectivism. I believe that they are better allocators of resources. But I do not believe those arguments are sufficient apart from attaching them to the anthropology that we're talking about. That is the study of the human person, a belief system about human nature, and a good understanding of man's purpose.
Yeah.
And so everything I'm trying to do in finance and economics has to be connected to those things.
Yeah. Well, it shows. You do a great job of it, and I'm glad you're able to get that from your dad, even though he left at an early age. I know that he would be proud of what you've done and where you continue to do with his knowledge and his insights that he was able to pass along to you within those 20 years. Because I'm sure being him a political philosopher and everything else probably wasn't easy when he would ask you a lot of questions growing up.
Yeah, those are very, very interesting dinner table conversations, and so very friendly. He taught me to try to be charitable and winsome, but to be persuasive.
Yeah, there you go. Well, coming at, I guess, from devil's advocate, just so we can have a good discussion and everything, I guess when you go, like you were saying earlier, on these elevator speeches to different places, and maybe they don't share our view of free markets and virtuous and free society, I guess to their point, they would say, well, work is something that we're forced to do. We don't want to do it. I mean, I almost think about it from a Marxian perspective, right? That the purpose of work is just to get a certain amount of output, and then we should be able to do the rest of the things that we want to do. It's really a side effect of the labor theory of value that goes into everything. And so we as workers, we should get 100% of it. The corporations, the employers, they're the ones that are taking all this away from us. And I wonder what your viewpoint is on some of those folks who are misguided in those ways.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And even the labor theory of value, I see as the effect of their wrong premises, of their inadequate foundation, not the cause of it. In other words, the flaws in the labor theory of value start with an idea that mankind is at war with nature, at war with the world, instead of understanding that at our basic foundation, we have been tasked with being caretakers of the world. That this is a blessing in which we get to co-create with God. That God made the raw material of the world and it was unfinished. There were no hula hoops or fire pits or iPhones at the Garden of Eden.
Right.
But there was the basic materials of nature from which mankind is not at war with, but is to now go create out of using these productive, innovative faculties. So that negative view of work necessarily comes out of some sort of Marxian idea. Now, there are very non-Marxian people that attach applications inconsistently. I think the retirement idea comes from a belief that is probably more hedonistic than Marxian, but nevertheless is rooted in the idea of if I can afford to not work, I don't need to or shouldn't have to work. Where my view would be that having great financial means is a blessing that adds convenience and adds margin and adds freedom, but not that it alleviates our normative state of being productive. And so where I think Marx was fundamentally wrong on this is viewing work as going against the nature of man, when I view work as being consistent with the nature of God and us being image bearers of God. Yep.
No, I agree with you, and I think that's where they fall prey to this. And we're still seeing this today, of course, as you mentioned earlier, whether it be Bernie Sanders or AOC. We're seeing more of this support for non-work, for the lack of work, And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, too, that I think is really important to stress is, for a long time with the safety nets or disability, those who had a disability, they would call them that they were able-bodied folks. Mm-hmm. But I think something that I've heard here recently is work capable is a better term, because just because you're not able-bodied doesn't mean you can't work. Yeah. You still have the capacity to do so, right?
Very much so, and it's entirely possible. Just to make one example, how hard it is to do micro when you're talking about macro, and yet there's people who I would say are 68 years old, 71 years old that used to chase bad guys up and down the street as cops. And I don't think they're going to have the same physical capacity to do that they used to when they were 35 years old in a different physical condition. But do they still have knowledge of law enforcement? Do they still have mentoring to younger people? Are they able to do counseling, mentoring, preparation, coaching? So there's still a capacity in which they can be useful, even though the age and stage of their life may have evolved. This is a very easy application when it comes to those who do work with their hands and their bodies and get to a point where they can't do so as much, that there's some activity in which they can still be useful. Now, a lot of people, because we do have more of a service-oriented economy, and there is from not just digital automation. This did not start with AI, and it really didn't even start, as you know, with the Industrial Revolution. The wheel was invented a long time before the Industrial Revolution. We're constantly looking at technology that is enhancing the efficiency of our productive efforts, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But those things are not done to alleviate the need for any work whatsoever so that we can move into a state of dormancy and idleness. I think, if anything, from a macro standpoint, it should enhance our total output.
Yeah.
And it's one of the tragedies of the digital revolution so far, is it has enabled us to do the same amount of work easier instead of get more output done.
Yep. And this was really something I found in the book that was really interesting. I don't know that I had thought about it before. It really it pushed me, which is good. That's what I like about these types of books is retirement. I know I've fallen prey to this, David, where I've said, I can't wait till retirement, and I'm going to be able to do all this stuff and spend time with my kids and go on vacations and do all these things. And after reading your book and thinking about it more, I've come maybe to the realization where I'm doing what I want to do now. I'm working. I'm doing what God's calling in my life. What I believe is to let people prosper. That's why I did this podcast and why I do the work that I do every day. And I'll just do it in a different way in retirement. Or maybe I'll keep working and, like to your point, doing it in different ways. I remember my grandfather, before he passed, said, you know what? One of the worst things I did was retire, because then I'm just sitting around and not doing nearly as much. And he waited until he was about 75, and he was a construction, he worked on bulldozers and everything, right? So he worked outside in the elements, but he wanted to keep working because he knew once he stopped that there was a downward decline. You see that with so many people that are out there. But I wonder what your thoughts were, or have been on retirement, or what you hear from other people, and how can we focus more on the work we're doing today?
I think that mentality that you had is pretty common, that is sort of ingrained in a lot of us, particularly in Gen Y, because they were mostly raised by boomers, and boomers were the first generation in human history that entered the workforce with an eye on this thing called retirement. And why is that? Why did retirement become unique? Why was it revolutionary for the baby boomer generation, those that were born between 1946 and 1964? Because there had never been a moment before where the mortality allowed for it. And there had never been a moment before where the prosperity allowed for it. And so people entering the workforce that had a life expectancy of age 60 suddenly had a life expectancy of age 70. And then as things continued throughout the last several decades, the age 70 life expectancy went up to age 80. It's 81 for women, 78 for men. And that coincided with a post-war economic boom that made us a much more materially prosperous society. So all of a sudden, we had this thing called retirement because we could, because we had age and money. And Madison Avenue is not stupid. They ran with it and marketed an idea. And I believe so many of those who touched the Great Depression had a cultural reason to crave the idea of being able to not work. They had gone through significant hardship, toil, turmoil. Many of them had gone through the war, oftentimes a more physical career. And so I could understand why it seemed attractive, but it was experimental. And I think we now know that there's been a number of side effects. One is people like your grandfather that, are used to being useful and active, and then they say, like, wait a second, I didn't sign up to just be laying around. They want to be busy and useful. And I also believe a major impact is into the economy via the industries and the atmospheres in which they work, lacking their wisdom, losing their expertise, losing their experience.
Yeah.
And now you have, I'll turn 50 years old next month, and so I'm a Gen X business owner that doesn't have 65 and 70-year-olds around for mentorship because they've retired. And it's a good thing actually about Wall Street that a lot of people do stick around a little bit longer. But my point being that throughout the commercial society that is America, we would be better off with older people. Now, you said I would like more time with my kids and grandkids and all that. See, my vision of retirement is not that those things can't happen. There's still more margin. There's still more freedom and convenience when one is in a later stage of life and greater financial resources, let alone time resources. I've been in a position of financial freedom for quite some time now, but what keeps me, I couldn't go live that life on the beach if I wanted to, even though I can afford it. I don't have the time for it. Because I don't plan to get rid of my endeavors and commitments. And so the one resource I have lacking is time, not treasure. But, I think in retirement, we entered it, and when I say we, the baby boomers that kind of codified this, thought of it as a 25-year vacation. And that is the part I'd push back on. Yeah. More time with kids, more time with grandkids, more, longer lunches with your spouse. Those things are all wonderful. Yep. But not a cutoff from all productive and useful activity. 7 days of golf seems a little excessive to me. Yeah. I don't seek to take away anyone's freedom to do what they want. I'm just simply suggesting that it is better for the human psyche for even our seniors to be engaged. And I know it's better for younger generations, for our seniors to be engaged. We need their expertise and wisdom.
Yeah, amen, amen. And of course, all this has implications on public policy. I've got a lot of leaders and legislators and congressional staff and members who listen to the podcast. And one of the things that this also has implications on is Social Security and how 67, the full retirement age, and Medicare, some of the major costs that some conservatives don't want to touch these days. But I think at some point we've got to come to the reality that these are what's driving our debt deficits and debt over time, and that we've got to come to some sort of agreement of, look, maybe not everyone needs to work as long, or maybe they need to work longer. That the why is 67 the cutoff age? Because some people, David, I'm sure you met these people, they'll also say, well, I can't wait to get Social Security. I can't wait till 67 or something of that nature, where that becomes kind of an arbitrary age that says, you know what, we're going to do this. And as you know, when Social Security was put in place in 1935 during the Great Depression, the average age life expectancy, I think, was around 50, 55, somewhere right around there, where when they put it, many people were not going to reach the age to even get on Social Security. And now people are living, as you said earlier, 78 for men, 81 for women. And if they can be full on the full part of Social Security in 67, that's another 13 years that they have on the program where people are getting a lot of payout compared to the amount that they are paying in. And so this has a lot of implications of this importance of work, which is why I think this is such an important book. But I wonder what your thoughts are on some of these, pressing policy implications for it.
Well, let me start by being a little bit harsher for some of our friends on the right. It isn't that they don't want to touch it. It's that they're afraid to talk about it. It's entirely political. They don't have different spreadsheets than you and I have. They don't have different models. They know the system becomes insolvent, and they also know a change will happen. Yeah. We are not debating about whether or not a change should happen. A change will happen. The famous Herb Stein dictum remains: if something can't continue, it won't. So all we're debating is how much in front of this we want to be. And people like you and I would argue that the future pain will be a lot less if we act now, and the future pain will be a lot greater if we don't. But nobody is debating about whether or not there's going to be pain. Politicians have the ability to suggest that we don't have to talk about it now, to the extent that their own career cycle will allow them to not talk about it now when it's hard, and then be gone from office later when it's harder. It's a beautiful business model, really. I think that we already know, by the way, it's currently age 65 and 8 months is the full retirement age. And that came about as a result of the so-called Greenspan Commission that was appointed by President Reagan in his first term in the early 1980s that moved the retirement age. That alone added a couple $2 trillion in net present value of solvency. I do not have any interest in pushing Granny off a cliff or taking 67-year-olds getting money now and telling them they don't get it. However, announcing now that people under the age of 55, 53, you can pick the age. You can say 50, and then you have lesser savings. You can say 55 and you have more savings. But there is a moral cushion zone by which this has to be somewhat untouchable based on promises and agreements made in the social contract. And we could debate what that age is, but for political realism purposes, I'm willing to say 55. So anyone who was expecting to get it at 65 and is 55 years right now and older, they would still get it. But to inform people younger that it's going to be, let's say, 68, they have 13 years to adjust and prepare. The net present value in that savings on 3 years alone is trillions of dollars. Not continuing to have a COLA, a cost of living adjustment for people over a certain net worth. Is means testing really what I want to do? No, but let's have a conversation about what we want to do. Because I do know this, that none of us are going to care about it being means tested, and not means testing people with over 7 figures in net worth or fit whatever you want to do. I hardly think that's at the extreme level of progressive that we already have in our tax system, and yet it saves monumental amounts of money. There are things like that that are just going to have to be done. And tying this into a broader societal conversation about work. My friend Ben Shapiro made a lot of hay recently by saying something to this effect, and it went viral on YouTube and all that. And viral for him means 20 million people, not 2 million people talking about it. And I think that what he said is a necessary part of the conversation. That, to your point earlier, Social Security was modeled as a safety net for people to start receiving it that were living longer than average lives. And we are right now paying out roughly 15 years below the life expectancy. It was not modeled, and the actuarial tables, if it were a private pension fund, would have been upside down 35 years ago.
I agree. And I think you're right on point that we need to do something about this. And we know President Biden isn't going to do anything. I'm hopeful if there is a President Trump, which I have my concerns about that on many levels. But if there is, that he will address Social Security and Medicare. I know whenever I was there in the first term, it was off the table. We couldn't touch it. And that maybe this time too, we'll see. But we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah, it's interesting because if he were to win, it would be a golden opportunity because, of course, he can't run for re-election. And so the political risk would be gone. But very candidly, I don't have to speak negatively here. I only have to quote him. He said it's off the table. He has said he won't address it. And what he did that is even more concerning than that is he mocked other candidates who did want to bring it up. So now it's not only that we're not going to do anything about it on the policy front, but that it's become sort of a taboo for those who are trying to be ideas people in the right around it. And I think that's really unfortunate. We need to have this conversation. There's things, knobs to be turned in what I just said. Yeah. I'm not totally comfortable with all my ideas, but Obama appointed the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Paul Ryan had done a lot of work with this. There's people of good faith. Yeah. On the center left and center right that have, pulled out their spreadsheet, their pen and paper. We have to do that. We have to do it. Yep. And just like I was so critical of President Obama for ignoring his own commission on this topic, I don't think we're doing ourselves any favor on the right to act like we don't have to talk about it.
Yep. So much wisdom here, David. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. There's a lot more that I wanted to talk to you about, but we've run out of time. But I'll have you on again on the Let People Prosper show, because I know that you've also got a lot of thoughts on, remote work and that sort of thing as well. But I hope people will go out and purchase a copy of the book. It's Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. I'll put in the show notes page and some other information from David's great work that he does. But David, God bless you and your family, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy being with you. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, David. And for the audience, please go out and give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed our conversation. Share this with your friends and family, and subscribe to wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, let people prosper.